The Christian faith has grown in 2,000 years from a single teacher, Jesus of Nazareth, and a small group of Jewish disciples, to 2 billion individuals worldwide, members of some 250 different denominations, representing about 1/3 of the world's population. Throughout its history, the Christian religion has played a major role in shaping the spiritual, social, political, and economic lives of Western civilization. Although Christianity has a rich collection of sacred documents, including the Christian Bible, from its earliest inception, the lack of any actual records created while Jesus was alive has stimulated an ongoing debate among Christians about what Jesus actually taught. That debate continues. As a result, we are left to inquire about the meaning of his message and his life on earth from many different perspectives that have been offered over the centuries. This freedom to interpret his birth, life, death, and resurrection seem to have been both a boon to Christianity's popularity and the source of its greatest challenges to remain relevant in our modern world. In some ways, the notion of the future of Christianity is unexplored territory, in that we seem to talk more about the past concerning the teachings of Jesus and not their potential to transform 21st century society. Particularly as the traditional church struggles to keep its members from leaving. Many of those who seek to remain within the faith seem unclear about their options to evolve or revitalize how they practice their Christianity in our time. In the next hour and a half, 2 extraordinary teachers and writers, Father Thomas Kitting and philosopher and best-selling author Ken Wilber, will give us their unique perspectives on Christianity and its potential to become a transformative force in our world. Think for a moment about your own Christian beliefs. Who is Jesus to you? What is your relationship with something larger than yourself? Do you believe the biblical writings are the literal Word of God, or scholarly stories that contain important teachings to guide us? How can these seemingly contradictory views all be a part of a genuine Christian faith? We are going to share with you a unique map that contains clues to unraveling these contradictions. It will help you explore the depth and breadth of your own Christianity and how it could transform your place in the kingdom of heaven that Jesus talked to us so much about. Join us as we make the extraordinary discovery that there seems to be not one Jesus, but many, and all are fundamentally correct, depending on how you choose to see him. How will you answer the question that Jesus asked in Matthew 16? Who do you say that I am? And what does your answer mean to the future of your Christianity? Father Thomas Kitting is a Trappist monk and a major force in the revitalization of the Christian contemplative movement. He is the founder of Contemplative Outreach and the author of many important Christian contemplative books, including Open Mind, Open Heart and Intimacy with God. Never heard of him or the Contemplative Path? If you haven't, you're in for a real treat. This extraordinary teacher has a message of hope for all of us who are seeking to evolve our Christian faith.
I began studying the history and then the theology on my own. I was now at Yale University as a fresh freshman. So instead of doing my studies, I spent all the time studying eventually the mystics, and so I started going to church a lot, hang out with the elderly ladies, circulating the side altars and going to novenas. In other words, I opened up to the whole schema without necessarily making a judgment about what devotion or this or that. I just took it all in because I was in a milieu that had no supports for a spiritual journey or even deep reflection on life itself. So that took me through a cycle of about 2 years, and I discovered during that time a book by St. Thomas Aquinas, which was not his theology, but a collage of the sayings of the great fathers of the church on the four Gospels, line by line. So on every section of the four Gospels, you got 7 or 8 enthralling and a teaching that was obvious to me. I didn't have the word for it at the time. Was a wisdom teaching coming from the heart or from experience, and from the experience of the living Christ. And so that's I knew was what I wanted to do with my life.
Father Keating was eventually called to use his gifts, but not in the way that he initially thought.
The best use I could make of my talents was to sacrifice them and enter an order where they probably would not be used, or they'd be used very modestly. Maybe I might become the guest master or something. Never entered my mind I might become the abbot, which actually happened sometime later, of that place. Nor did I have the remotest idea of contributing to the renewal of the Christian contemplative tradition. I was aware that it had been lost or had been put on the back burner, and that people in church or in Catholic schools, and I think it was also the same in any Christian school, didn't have the intuition into the fact that the Christian religion is about transformation into Christ. Nothing else. It's about entering into the experience that Christ had of the Father, of the ultimate reality, as Abba, which literally means in the Aramaic something like daddy. So this is a revolutionary change in this transcendent concept of God that tends to overshadow the fact that God is equally and infinitely immanent, that is more present to us, as Augustine says, I believe, than we are to ourselves.
Ken Uilber is a best-selling author and philosopher. He is the founder of Integral Institute and Integral Spiritual Center, and a major contributor to Integral Life. Many consider his book, Integral Spirituality, a startling new role for religion in the modern and postmodern world, to be the most important spiritual book in modern times. Roger Walsh, author of Essential Spirituality, calls Ken one of the greatest philosophers of this century. On his first day of college, Ken had a realization that would characterize the rest of his advanced graduate studies.
I went to Duke University in the medical program, and as soon as I got there, realized that, literally the very first day I was in Duke, and sat down in the bed and undid one shoe, and by the time the proverbial second shoe hit the floor, I knew I wanted nothing to do with it. I'd come out of high school, I was valedictorian, I was, golden boy, and my parents were shocked when I got to Duke and literally dropped out. And this is late 1960s, so it was something that the boomers were sort of doing. The reason I did is I was getting nothing new that I hadn't gotten in a really fine high school education. And so it was focused on science, and to simply do more science struck me as exactly what I didn't want to do. Now, it wasn't that I was anti-science. It's just that science was not answering the questions I wanted answered.
As Ken explored his questions about the nature of ultimate reality, he was drawn to contemplative practices in the East and the West. These were psychotechnologies that made the claim that they could bring one face to face with God.
What was starting to come in the late 60s was the contemplative traditions. And although there were particularly stemming from the East, there were plenty of contemplative traditions in the West. St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila, Meister Eckhart, the Victorine mystics, Cloud of Unknowing, St. Dionysius of Pseudo-Areopagitai. There was a whole rich lineage of contemplative practices in the West. And it was the contemplative practices, East and West, that caught me up, because they were something entirely different from learning the myth and believing the myth as a sort of narrative structure that is created for you, and you say, yes, I believe that Jesus was born of a Virgin Mary, and et cetera, et cetera. These were practices. They were actually psychotechnologies of awakening consciousness to an identity with the Christ principle itself.
These two unlikely collaborators have been friends and colleagues for years, exchanging views on spirituality and Christianity at Integral Spiritual Center events. They will act as our guides as we take this initial journey into the future of Christianity. One of the things that Western psychology has added to the cultural conversation is to look at individuals from birth and track the differences in their capabilities from infancy to childhood, to adolescence, to adults and older. We all recognize that we evolve through a variety of stages on the road of life. We come into the world as infants, grow into childhood, advance into adolescence, mature into adults, and eventually become elders. At each of these phases of life, we have different mental, physical, and emotional capabilities. What's interesting about stages of development is that it's not just that we experience them as individuals, but our cultures do as well. For the sake of this exploration, we will focus on 5 stages of development as they apply to Christianity. Here are some basic differences between these 5 stages. Humans at the magic stage are impulsive in nature. They strive to take care of individual safety and to gratify their basic needs. They believe the things that happen in their world oftentimes are magical. They have an egocentric worldview. Humans at the mythic stage extend their circle of care and concern to include other individuals in their tribe, group, or nation. As such, they have a very ethnocentric worldview, which defines their group along us versus them boundaries. They value stability, purposefulness, and group-accepted beliefs and behaviors. As we will see later, this us versus them mentality can lead to conflict. Humans at the rational stage relate not just to the group they belong to, but begin to value all other humans regardless of their group distinctions. This is the start of a world-centric view, and along with it comes a valuing of autonomy, success, and the power of science. As they expand their perspectives to include many possible versions of what is right, they still believe that one system fits all situations, or that one way can be judged as most right. Humans at the pluralistic stage begin to recognize the true diversity in the world, different backgrounds and situations. Here we find an expanded world-centric outlook that values diversity, equality, and different interpretations of different people. There is a tolerance of multiple truths and a belief that there are many paths to salvation. Humans at the integral stage recognize for the first time that all previous stages of development make an important contribution to who we are as a culture, and that all individuals have the ability to progress through these stages of development in the course of their evolution. People at this stage are keenly aware of the interplay of awareness, thought, action, and effect, and they value personal and cultural transformation. If for the moment you accept this basic concept of stages of development, isn't it possible that each of these stages would have a different interpretation of Christianity in the world? Let's see how this unfolds as Ken Wilber explores who Jesus becomes at each of these 5 stages of development, and how the Christianity that Jesus is connected to at each stage shows up differently in the world.
At magic, Jesus is viewed as the source of personal miracles. So it's not water into wine, loaves, fishes, and so on, but it is also a miraculous cure of any illness I have. It's petitionary prayer. It's getting me, myself, what I want, And this is, of course, egocentric magic. As I move to the mythic, there's the thrill of finding an everlasting, unchanging truth. That I finally know exactly what's true. There's one and only one truth, and that can be found in the Bible, which is the Word of God, the absolute literal truth of God. And Moses really did part the Red Sea, and everything the Bible says is literally and absolutely true, including that Jesus is the only begotten Son of God. It's a very fundamentalistic approach. So if I'm at this stage and I find Jesus, then I'm finding a fundamental truth that is unshakable and gives me a source of absolute strength and calm and peace, because I have all the answers, and that is what I'm looking for. The next is, if we move on and move from ethnocentric myth to world-centric rational, Jesus is looked upon here as a humanistic world teacher. He's not the only teacher. He's one among other teachers, but he is the one that's the best for me. That's an extremely important developmental divide, because it marks the difference between ethnocentric, I have the only path, only those who believe in Jesus can be saved, only those who believe in Buddha can be saved, only those who believe in Krishna can be saved, to a world-centric understanding that there are many enlightened world teachers, but the one that I'm following happens to be the best one for me. The pluralistic stage is Jesus is again understood as one among many enlightened teachers, and all of these teachers are teaching essentially postmodern pluralistic truths, and all of those basically rest on trying not to marginalize anybody. So it's an attempt at inclusiveness, an attempt at tolerance, and even though the truths taught by these teachers are open, and by Jesus, are open to interpretation, different interpretation by different parts of the world, all of these interpretations can offer salvation if they're adopted in a sincere and genuine fashion. And then finally, integral is Christ is spirit in first person of every being alive. It's Christ viewed as I amness, as the deep fundamental source that is not only ever present and present in every human and sentient being, but is the ground of integrating all essential and profound truths. And so Christ becomes a truly integrated consciousness, and is recognized as the part of the leading edge of evolution itself. And this is something that integral theory maintains, is that evolution is continuing, spirit is continuing, it's evolving, it's unfolding, and to take up an integral stance to this is to look at all of these various factors, take them all into account, and then move forward from there.
The fact that each of these stages of development has a different view of Jesus is a revolutionary method of unpacking how Christianity shows up as a wide variety of very different perspectives in the world. But what value does it hold for individuals who are looking to evolve their Christian faith to the next level?
Having a map that this is the normal development, however individualized it is, and it is very individual. There are as many spiritual paths as there are people. And that's why general instruction is only a reassurance or a help. And every now and then there's some new exceptions or nuances or refinements that maybe hasn't been present yet in the tradition in a way that can be articulated. So psychology provides a tool or a way to articulate states and stages of consciousness that we just didn't have before, and to see a certain order in them, although it's not an absolute order. And it's very consoling for people if they can have their experience validated.
If you can no longer validate your experience of Jesus and the teachings of the traditional church, but don't want to leave the faith, what are the implications of all of this for you? What do stages of development have to do with whatever crisis of faith you are having? What gets better understood as you look at your spiritual line of development that can suggest ways for you to find a new center of gravity within Christianity?
Part of what causes a crisis of faith is individuals have taken their spiritual understanding up to the mythic level of development in the spiritual intelligence line. And being stuck there, they are, of course, going to run into a huge crisis of faith if they continue to intellectually develop. If they go to college, if they just continue their life development. And so the single best recommendation for those individuals is to develop their spiritual intelligence from mythic to rational and start to move in that direction. Because most of the things that turn them off, most of the things that are causing a crisis in faith, are things that make their faith appear irrational. And the fact of the matter is, they are irrational. So by moving to rational and learning to recast the Christian faith in that, and of which there are many different approaches out there to doing this, that's the single best recommendation I can give to somebody who is having a crisis of faith, is it's really not a crisis of your belief in the Christ principle, which you're probably still believing it because you can probably still feel it. There's this fundamental core understanding that there's a profound center of awareness in you, a center of I amness that you can't shake, and that is the very source of your being, and is indeed Christ in you, Christ in all sentient beings. And so that's something that you're still believing in, but you're forced to take that and put it into these mythic, literal structures. That doesn't help. That doesn't help you get along in a rational world. That doesn't help you get along at college. It doesn't help you get along really in any area where these types of understandings are required.
But what do I do with the Christian traditions that I don't want to let go of as I evolve my faith? How can I rise above what I now see as their limitations, but still maintain a relationship with Jesus? And what about other religions? What role can they play in me revitalizing my Christian faith?
What we need not to do is to reject what we have had, because it may have had more effect on our state of mind or our balance than we know. But that it has limitations means that we have to find ways of activating those possibilities in the context of our faith, or if necessary, add to them in somewhere else where the experience might be better articulated. So this is why a friendly, collaborative, and cooperative relationship with other religions is essential in our day, because the communication is growing, and hence it's possible, if you take the time to learn their language in terms where one can be enriched in one's own faith, as I certainly have been, by the knowledge and admiration of the wisdom that God has given in other times and places.
Even though I may see the value of evolving my practice of Christianity to the rational level or higher, there is still the question of how I'm supposed to hold the teachings of Jesus in our time. These teachings originated over 2,000 years ago in a culture that was at a very different level of development than we are. In addressing this question of how Jesus fits in the modern world, it is important to remember that even though human culture has developed a great deal since the biblical period, we still create stories that make sense of the world as we currently view it. And these days, our stories can be influenced by any number of different sources if we broadened our inquiry to include the latest from modern fields of study, including archaeology, molecular science, quantum physics, as well as new developments in spiritual evolution.
When it comes to believing the origin of this universe, you have basically two choices. You can either say, when somebody asks, where does this universe come from? You can say, well, I don't know. It just comes. It just shows up. And that's the philosophy of whoops. And so it's just, whoops, here it comes. And that is supposed to be some form of profound response. It is, as far as I can tell, profound ignorance. It's just throwing your hands up and saying, beats me. And I'm not anti-science. As I said, all of my degrees up to this point were scientific. So I was very, very predisposed to science. But science wasn't answering these fundamental questions, or not even answering. It wasn't giving you indications of how to look for these answers.
Even if you believe that science or religion has all the answers, can it really help you know that there is a God or not?
In our time, science has become a kind of additional religion insofar as it's seeking the unknown and is generally humble in acknowledging its limitations. For instance, the more they know in science, genuine science, in many areas, the more they know they don't know. But that's very important information. So if science succeeds in doing that, it'll be a great service. For instance, we now just discovered 96% of the universe is dark matter, which nobody knows what it is. So that doesn't sound like world-shattering progress. But in another sense it is, because it's important to know what we don't know and a willingness to learn more. And so science has become a search for the unknown, the same as religion is, because religion doesn't know God either. It says no one can know God and live.
We all have our stories that help us make meaning, and as we've seen, they can be informed by a number of sources. Scientific knowledge and religious teachings are just two of the most prominent ones in our present culture. But what happens when these two heavyweights reside at different stages of development?
What we really want is a way for Christianity to mesh with the modern and postmodern world. Because one of the biggest problems that we have and that we worry about is that if we look at the sort of evolutionary stages of development in worldviews, that classically Gene Gebser first outlined them, go from archaic to magic to mythic to rational to pluralistic to integral and higher. The problem is that Christianity is too often stuck in the mythic layer of development. So it's gone from archaic to magic to mythic, and there it sort of got stuck. And then above that, rational is what occurred in the Western Enlightenment. And so the Western Enlightenment turned out to be not what it should have been, which is Christianity moving from mythic spiritual intelligence to rational spiritual intelligence. and science moving from a mythic understanding to a rational understanding. But instead what we saw was science move to rational, and religion stay stuck at mythic. And so that's a disaster, because then all around the world we have what I call this steam, the steel pressure cooker. And science is sort of on top, holding religion down. And that's not only not necessary, it's a catastrophe. And because science, remember, is dealing with relative truths. It's not dealing with ultimate truths. And so what should have been happening is every major level of development, archaic, magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic, integral plus, has a scientific understanding at its level and a religious understanding at its level. So way back down in the magic era, there were shamanic understandings of religion, which had their particular type of seeing the world, and was a particular religious type of organizing the world. But there was also science. Any type of technological understanding that the tribes had was their version of science at that time. And the science was relatively crude, but so was the religion. So as we see both of these evolve, what we want to see is that the religious spiritual intelligence can move not just up to myth, but into rational and into pluralistic, into integral, because that opens up an understanding for spiritual orientation that doesn't just stick it, freeze it at a mythic level in its own line. That'd be just as bad as having science get stuck in a mythic level of its own line.
The cultural friction will continue to exist between science and religion until they evolve to the same level of development. But is there another conceptual issue for Christianity that contributes to the traditional church being stuck at mythic? Is it something that must be understood before you can bring your Christianity into the modern world? Did something happen in the church that needs to be healed in you?
Christianity in general, having been too preoccupied with the differences of doctrine, forgot to lead the Christian life. And in fact, the contemplative dimension was looked upon with some suspicion at times, because its language, mystical language, is the language of exaggeration. It's the language of the bedroom, you might say, where the spouses may say to each other, "I adore you," and so on. It doesn't mean they're substituting their spouse for God, but they're trying to find words that are strong enough to express the intensity of their love or passion at the time. So theology has to understand that and allow mystical language as a form of poetry to express a mystery that theology is trying to express on its level. But lacking the experience of it, it sounds a little dry and legalistic at times.
20% of the American public considers themselves to be spiritual but not religious. What is the difference between these two forces? And how could understanding their role in religious life contribute to bringing these two vital elements of faith together again?
Clearly, the simple phrase spiritual and religious has pointed to at least a few differences. One is direct, live, vital, experiential revelations. That is done through singing, dancing. There's a whole series of practices that have developed around this, evangelical and Pentecostal, and they're fairly effective And then there is the old time church, where you just sort of sit, listen to. It's very depressing. I mean, most people just don't like church. It just doesn't have much meaning to them. Whereas this other spiritual rocking and rolling, that's a kick, and people sort of get off on that. And I think that is eventually going to hook up with the contemplative traditions in the West and contemplative traditions in the East.
If spirituality and religion are actually two complementary parts of our religious faith, why is it important for us to resolve their differences?
It's like with a divorce. Spirituality and religion are really married, and theology and without spirituality is pretty deficient. And spirituality without some conceptual background is also not fully human. So what we need to do is something that was understood at an earlier period, at least by a significant number of people, in the fathers of the church, as we call them in the Roman Catholic tradition. And to them, they couldn't imagine a separation. In other words, perhaps you've heard the term St. John the Divine. The divine is another word for theologian. So a theologian without spirituality was not considered a theologian in those days. In other words, you had to have both the experience as well as the capacity to articulate it. So somewhere down the ages, these two got separated. In other words, it's like a couple who had a divorce. It was a happy marriage and very fruitful in spiritual children or in good, in true religious devotees, perhaps manifested in the religious movements of the early church and Middle Ages. So when you have a divorce, the people who suffer are usually the children the most. And so the whole of the people of God, so to speak, all of Christians have suffered and will continue to suffer until these two complementary and necessary connections are restored and they get back into bed together and share life. What many are experiencing is just the result of a situation where there was proper instruction, but not adequate practice to understand it, appreciate it, or to interiorize it. Now, when you have a big organization, there are 2 billion Christians around the world, it's pretty hard to organize anything but a fast food joint as far as the ritual goes. So the individual has to be influenced by people who do perceive the necessity of putting these two things together. If your parents can't do it, it's great help if your nurse, so to speak, can fill in where they can't in the way of affection or knowledge. But here the problem is that nobody knows where to go, and our own inner difficulties or ignorance or lack of knowledge as to how to proceed, or knowledge of the tradition as to how others succeeded, gives it an extreme poignancy for those who really want spirituality and who don't want to give up the good things they experienced in their religion, how to put these two together when much of the present presentation or ritual that they experience in church is not awakening their need for spirituality.
You could witness the cultural confusion about religion and spirituality every day if you watch television or listen to talk radio. Why is it important for us as individuals to understand the problems this causes in our culture?
What happened with the media is that it came into existence roughly with the Western Enlightenment. And the Western Enlightenment itself came into existence roughly as an anti-religious move. And so we had the birth of liberal politics, and that liberal politics was dedicated to undermining, to having done with, to eradicate the religious forms at that time. I mentioned it a lot, but Voltaire's battle cry for the Western Enlightenment was, remember the cruelties. Remember the cruelties inflicted by the church on millions of human beings. And so this was a profound beginning of, instead of having science and religion grow together, of having religion sealed off at mythic and science starting and moving up, keeping religion down, which is still an absolute disaster. The battle between these two has continued to today, which is where the liberal media, and bless its heart, I mean, it's the conservative media doesn't do any better, in some ways does worse. I'm not picking on that. But the liberal media has a deep misunderstanding about what religion or spirituality is. And the liberal itself coming into existence as an anti-religious force, basically, has been left in that position ever since. It really doesn't know what to do with religion, or spirituality, for that matter. And so the liberal press just has a few categories for anything religious or spiritual. If you're displaying these kinds of impulses, then you are either a New Age nutcase or you're a fundamentalist nutcase. And that's about it. And so that is not too explanatory. That's not too helpful in terms of what the deeper and more profound aspects of religion can be. And so it turns out then that the liberal media likes a religious movement if it likes the leader of that movement. And the leader looks safe and benign and careful. So the press loves the Dalai Lama, which, well, they should. But, I mean, he drinks Coca-Cola and he laughs and he smiles and he's got a good heart. And he says, the essence of my religion is being kind to people, which is sweet, but categorically misleading. The essence of that religion is spending years in meditation. But that understanding really cripples what is going on in the world. And then because they lump together what the Dalai Lama is doing with what Pat Robertson is doing, or what Oral Robertson is doing, or what Al-Qaeda is doing, that for them it's just this religious thing is all one entity. And they have no real clear understanding of how to differentiate it. Except, again, if they like the leader, then they sort of like the religion. If they don't like the leader, they don't like the religion. That is a catastrophe, in my opinion, because, as we were saying earlier, religion is two things, religion and spirituality. One is, it is the largest source of human suffering on the planet. And second case, it's the one great way to get out of suffering. I mean, the paths of great liberation, the contemplative core of the great spiritual traditions, is a way to transcend suffering, to get out of suffering, and to find the peace that surpasses understanding. And this has been the whole core of what the great liberation is all about. To have these things lumped together, to have what a Father Thomas Keating is doing lumped together with what Pat Robertson's doing, or to have Genpo Roshi lumped together with what Al-Qaeda is doing, is absolutely a travesty. It's complete, really disaster in terms of the culture, information at large. And so we're stuck with a mushing together of these spiritual approaches that makes it almost impossible to get them teased apart. And that's what's so really terrible about this approach.
If evolving our faith requires some sort of contemplative spiritual practice, why is it that many in the Christian tradition don't know about the Christian contemplative path? Is it the greatest story never told?
Christian contemplative heritage actually is rooted in a number of mystical passages in the Old Testament. There's plenty of witness there to this level of religious life in the prophets, and it's strewn throughout the Psalms, which is a book of various relationships with God and how these can be expressed in a poetic way. But when Christ comes along, it's clear that he's in the tradition of the prophets and the wisdom teachers, and so he has some things to say about prayer, and perhaps the most fundamental one is in Matthew 6:6, when he speaks of not just of the necessity of praying in private, but the necessity of entering one's inner room, as might be a good translation of the word. Because in his time, the Palestinian people didn't usually have a private room. They were lucky to have a roof over their head. So the passage goes like this: if you want to pray, and this raises immediately the question, what is prayer? What is the essence of prayer? And its essence is a relationship with the ultimate reality. Now, in advancing in the spiritual journey, reality itself can become the ultimate reality. In other words, God is reality, whatever it is, in a certain sense, in the sense of an enlightened faith which sees God as the source and present in everything that exists in virtue of his omnipresence. God is existence, said St. Thomas Aquinas, and therefore must be present in everything that exists. So to relate to this reality is what prayer is, and there are various ways of doing so, all the way from a very primitive and childish way of doing so to the highest form of enlightenment or mystical union. So this teaching is there from the beginning, but it takes a while to understand, and it takes certain steps of consciousness to climb up to realizing what Jesus is saying. That's why in the parables he usually ends them with the invitation, "If you have ears, please hear," implying that he knew very well that most people weren't listening. Basically, we only hear what we're willing to hear. And we only hear well what we want to hear. So that the ways that the false self has of filtering out thoughts that is suggestions we'd just as soon disregard. Is amazing capacity. But anyway, the ultimate capacity is an addiction in which you're so busy feeling miserable you don't have time to think of God or anybody else. But in any case, the saying that Jesus offers, if you want to pray, implying if you want to enter into these deeper levels of relationship with the Father, His Word for the ultimate reality, then enter your inner room, which is an invitation to withdraw, at least temporarily, from the external world and open to the spiritual level of one's being. That may be a mystery to us. It is, actually, and some people don't even think they have one. And so it's an invitation to cultivate the spiritual level of our being, and the only way to do that is to stop temporarily focusing and being obsessed and dominated by the events or the words or the distractions or the work or the entertainment or the pursuit, or the wild pursuit of our emotional programs for happiness that we think will bring us through gratification to what we're not experiencing otherwise.
How do we enter into silence, and what does it help us with that can calm the overwhelming nature of our thoughts?
There's really 3 stages of entering into interior silence. And silence is so important for us because it's one of the great ways of undermining our over-dependence on our own thoughts and feelings, or over-identifying with them, so that we're dominated by them rather than by the spiritual values that are lying dormant, waiting to be awakened through practice in our ontological unconscious, meaning they're really there. And we just think they aren't. Stop thinking for a few minutes, deliberately at least, and these values begin to appear spontaneously in the form of peace, inner freedom, even rest, in a spiritual sense. And that, if it's strong enough, affects the body, which rests too, and then the defense mechanisms around the things we've repressed into the unconscious and the emotional wounds of a lifetime begin to trickle into consciousness too. So silence and God are virtually the same thing as far as practice goes. So that just to sit down and shut up is sometimes all somebody needs to begin to contact this deeper reality, which is our source, and which the Christian religion proclaims is not just a source of energy, source of our being, but loves us with a personal and caring and motherly kind of concern that is permanent, 24 hours a day. So why don't we experience this, or feel it, or even occasionally? Well, some people do feel it occasionally. But it's deeper than an occasional experience. It involves a permanent awakening, stage by stage, to a reality that dwells within us, but which cannot be put into a particular experience or concept. It's too big. It won't go into any box. It's liberating, and it's always present. And some people experience it more than others. But the obstacle to experience it is precisely the preoccupation with the superficial level of our consciousness, which is everyday psychological consciousness consisting of judgments, evaluations of people entering and leaving our lives, and the razzmatazz of having to deal with emotional programs that are constantly being frustrated by daily life or reality.
These states of silence or consciousness have been documented for thousands of years by all the major religious traditions. But would it surprise you to learn that we all experience these states every 24 hours?
According to virtually all of the main contemplative traditions, there are these 4 or 5 major states of consciousness. And one is the waking state, and one is the dreaming state, and one is the deep, formless sleep state, and one is the non-dual flow state. Now, to say that one of these states is, for example, subtle dreaming, illumination state, doesn't mean that you experience that just during the dream. You can experience during the day, and you can experience a subtle state during moments of illumination or creativity or any sort of powerful visionary interior state that can happen when you're waking or sleep. But it happens quite frequently and naturally in the sleep state. As a matter of fact, all 4 of these states are something that are available to individuals every 24 hours. We go from waking into dreaming, into deep sleep, and then back. And what the great paths of liberation are maintaining is that if you could do this with a little bit of awareness, you would literally actually meet God face to face. Because that is where spirit is hanging out in everybody.
Another common assumption that is being challenged lately is that the awareness of these states of consciousness exists only at the top of the developmental ladder. However, the latest in integral research has revealed a connection between the stages of development and these states of consciousness that suggest a different perspective.
That realization can occur at any of those vertical structures of development. And that's, again, one of the really important things that we found out. That realization of going through gross, subtle, causal, and non-dual consciousness can occur at the mythic level. It can occur at the rational level. It can occur at the pluralistic level. It can occur at the integral level. And so that's been a very important understanding for us, because it does show that these, again, are 2 different progressions. And you will tend to interpret the state experiences according to the structures that you're at. So if you're at the mythic, if your fundamental center of gravity, your fundamental mental apparatus is at the mythic stage, then you'll interpret the gross, subtle, causal, and non-dual experiences of meditation fundamentally from that mythic stage. Because your mind can only work with what it has. And if that's what it has, that's how it will interpret it. And this has given us an enormous help in understanding, because so many people will go through the meditative states, but they're at different altitudes. And they'll clash. They get very different readings from each other. And they'll interpret the ultimate unification state, or what Tibetan Buddhism would call the Mahā'ati state, or great perfection state, or the supreme identity. They'll interpret it differently. And you have to see that they're interpreting it from the different level that they are themselves at. And so, again, putting together these vertical levels, these horizontal states, gives us a way to understand growth and development in both of these really important areas. And what we are looking for in integral spirituality, and particularly in integral Christianity, right now, is a way to fundamentally outline how each of these positions looks. So what does it look like to be at the mythic stage and have gross, have subtle, have causal, have non-dual? What's it like to be at the rational stage and have gross, have subtle, have causal, have non-dual? So we're getting a whole grid of what it is like to be at different levels and different states. And the ultimate goal, of course, is to be at the highest vertical level, namely to be at integral or integral plus, and at the widest, deepest state. So to be an integral and non-dual is the definition now of enlightenment. So we have both a horizontal enlightenment and a vertical enlightenment, and we want both now. So that's sort of upped the bar on what to consider as enlightenment. Because again, we know many people that can live in the now moment in depth just perfectly. But their vertical stage of development is pluralistic. And so they actually interpret ultimate reality as merely pluralistic terms, which shortchanges reality dramatically. And then others are all the way at integral, integral plus, but their state can just be subtle. They're not at causal or non-dual. So we have a matrix where we can give a person's, there are two centers of gravity. We can give the vertical center of gravity, they're at archaic, they're at magic, they're at mythic, they're rational, they're pluralistic, and then comma, whatever the state is. And this gives us a way to much more accurately map and gauge where individuals are, not as a way of pigeonholing them or boxing them in or ranking them or anything like that, but so individuals themselves can determine if they want to go ahead and practice more. And they can say, well, I'm doing really good. I've got an integral understanding, but my meditative understanding is only subtle. I want to really take up meditation and get to causal and non-dual. And so it's a diagnostic tool for individuals to help them determine where they are and how much more practice they want or need to do.
We all make meaning by creating stories, and perhaps we seek a contemplative path in Christianity. But does this work suggest practices that can help us develop a new center of gravity in our Christian faith? And if so, how do I relate to the ancient teachings of Jesus in this modern world?
Why should we now, with our level of scientific information, be interested in someone who spoke 2,000 years ago or longer? My answer would be, and it's only my idea, nothing more than that, is that you'll never find a time when you can exhaust the wisdom of the divine itself. And so the reason to listen to Christ is to use his articulation of the mystery in his time as the basis for trying to understand the experience of divine union in our time. Using then the cultural developments, if there have been any, and I suppose there have been some, not enough, I would say, to appreciate with our extra resources the teaching more than ever before, and this is not a bad, not an insignificant idea, because I don't think the teaching on oneness, forgiveness of enemies, unconditional love, the service of others, the gift of oneself, I don't think that Christians have ever heard this at a sufficiently deep level. The message is still the same because it's reality that is being communicated by a wisdom teacher, and especially one that is wisdom itself, at least in the view of its practitioners. So we cannot exhaust the wisdom of Christ. So whatever knowledge we bring to it happens to be our particular cultural development at this stage in human history, which is the same experience, different articulation.
We will always experience the teachings of Jesus through the lens of our culture. But is there a value in looking at Jesus and the ultimate reality that he points to through other cultures and traditions?
The Christian tradition is largely comes out of Hebrew and Greek culture, and the terms, the theology, the philosophy are highly influenced by them. But these are not the only ways it could be expressed. And this is what some of the great figures of the last century who tried to lead the Christian contemplative life inside a Hindu culture have said and contributed. And it would be very enriching to understand the mystery of Christ, to do it from a number of different religions like that, which has still waiting to be done, although it's beginning. So this is one of the aspects of the development of ideas or of religions, that as time goes on, and especially if they interact among themselves, everybody sees that the ultimate experience is illuminated by approaching it from different cultural aspects. So you can't communicate the thing itself, because the ultimate experience of God is no experience. Because there's no way to have an experience without it being enculturated, and God is not in any one culture. So to have many different views of the same ultimate reality is enriching for all of them if they perceive where they're in unity and where they are legitimately diverse. They're legitimately diverse in the way they express the experience. They're unified in the ultimate experience, and that's what's crucial.
Is there something else going on here that I must look at differently? If spirit is truly unfolding and moving forward and not static, how do I relate to this? Does true evolution actually include spirit?
A large part of it has to do with when we reformulate what Christianity is, what it means, and what it does, what its function is. And in part, what we are seeing is that the Christian unfolding is an evolutionary unfolding of spirit itself. And so that is something that's been true all the way back to shamans. But because we are in an era of evolution and we have an understanding of evolution, then we sort of look more closely at that and take this understanding going all the way back. And what we see going all the way back is a leading edge of evolution. And this leading edge is something that profoundly sets up the nature of religion itself, an understanding of the nature of Christ itself, nature of the understanding of Jesus itself. And these are essentially the very, very, very leading, frothy edge of creative evolution as it unfolds. It's spirit moving forward and unfolding as it goes forward. There's no question but that evolution of some variety has occurred. And even people like Huston Smith, who's a very dear friend of mine, acknowledges that evolution occurs. It's why does it occur? And that's where he disagrees with the scientific explanation of why evolution occurs. Incidentally, I agree with Huston Smith that the standard explanation of why it occurs, why evolution unfolds, why animal species get more evolved, why ideas get more involved, why spirit gets more involved, cannot be explained by Jacques Monod's chance and necessity. And this is a constantly argued position, but it's, fundamentally inescapable. There are too many factors in evolution that cannot be explained by chance and necessity alone. That's not to say that a lot can't be explained that way. It can. But much, much, much of it cannot. And that part that cannot be explained, the simplest, Occam's razor, scientific understanding of why it can't be explained traditionally, is that there is a simpler, more straightforward explanation of what's happening with evolution. And what's happening with evolution is that it is spirit's own unfolding.
The concept of the evolution of spirit is intriguing, but how do I shape my personal practice so that I can have some access to a direct experience of these states of consciousness? How do I find a place that honors this deeper work?
The two great teachers in this world as a structure is example and silence. So these have to be present in seminaries, as well as the theology. What has happened is that seminaries as a whole have taken over the academic model of secular universities, which is excellent in the particular courses that are offered, and this takes up all the time. And so they come out with a great deal of knowledge, and they sometimes have a great deal of value, social justice information, or all of this is valuable, but someone who's going to be a leader in a Christian community has got to have this other dimension to really communicate the whole package. And until that is done, people in the pews are not going to hear much about it, and those who want spirituality are going to go elsewhere. It's that simple. And they are going elsewhere in great numbers. It often happens after they've benefited from another discipline to calm their anger and fears or whatever. They often feel a yearning to return to their Christian roots if they could do so, if they could find a place where the spirituality of contemplative prayer is honored. Perhaps you should say just a word that spirituality has many meanings in our culture, but the one I think we're talking about is the spirituality that comes from contemplation, by which I mean deep meditation, non-conceptual prayer that is might be called heartfulness in the Hebrew sense of the word, of combining both the mind and the heart and one's whole strength in that formula of the biblical vision together. And so now I'm just addressing one way of doing this. Now, lots of people are not going to wait for seminaries to come around. It looks like it's going to be a long wait, but it could change because many are really trying. The problem is there's nobody to teach it. So these small groups of spiritual renewal, such as the contemplative outreach or the Christian World Community for Christian Meditation, they're dealing with volunteers all the time and people who have a family and other business and professions. Who's going to spend a semester or a whole year in a seminary to teach the contemplative mode? And even among them, they haven't been in enough training themselves for them to do it, except certain people who have an opportunity to develop both academic expertise and this practical spirituality we're talking about. What I think can saves the situation from a certain gloomy-looking future, or at least present, is the fact that the Holy Spirit is present in these movements and is present in us, and that it doesn't take a lot to call forth what is already present in people, whose very interest in spirituality is an indication that the Holy Spirit is working in them. And so these, if we can give these people and persuade them to themselves undertake a regular program of non-conceptual prayer and meditation, and to work on the false self, or the shadow side, as Jung calls it, as our faults or our mixed motivation appears in everyday life, then this divine therapy, so to speak, will heal many of these wounds. And just as contemplation tends to enable people to understand or practice or apply the principles or laws intelligently and in a mature way and in the light of the gospel, so it could help people to relax their indignation or their disappointment or their laments about not being able to find this teaching in the Christian scheme of things, or in other religions for that matter.
My first recommendation is to read up and take your understanding of the Christ consciousness, the Christ principle, and move it into rational, move it into pluralistic, move it into integral, and take any number of great Christian avant-garde theologians with you, sticking with the mythic narrative and the mythic interpretation of Jesus cripples Jesus. It narrows what you can read into him. It limits the power that you have in terms of who do you call me, and really cuts down on the nature of realization that you can have.
So once again, we come to this question: do I really need to forget all that I value about my experience in the traditional Christian church?
So one doesn't have to forget the tradition in order to renew it. But the tradition is not is static either, and to be really itself needs to adjust to circumstances that are important in a new culture, a new age. And this is what they all have done in varying degrees of success and time spans. But to keep up to date, especially in a global village that is developing in so many directions as fast as the human family is right now, you almost need a body of people and a convention or a conference or a think tank that some have tried to do so, but that is a kind of United Nations of religions, you might say, or a reunited body of applied spirituality or something like that. The problem, of course, with that is there's a deep loyalty in each of the traditions that has social implications, that one feels one belongs to a group, and if you dilute it too much with interreligious dialogue, some of the people will feel very uneasy. But that's part of the growing up process, I think, of the human species, that we're not just lambs anymore. or dumb sheep.
Is there one quality that underlies all I want to experience as I explore my Christian faith?
Well, the common denominator is silence, because that silence is non-denominational. It's a need of our spiritual nature. It's a part of humanity, and as people get noisier and pace of the world gets faster, people, just to be human, are going to call for periods of silence and find silence almost like an ecstasy. Some people have never experienced one moment of it in this culture. So the true self emerges little by little in the silence, and it manifests itself in the exercise in daily life and in prayer of the fruits and gifts of the Spirit. But is that the ultimate you? Who not only are you, or who are you, but is there a you at all? And the answer to that is our deepest self is Christ. So that in this sense, the world of God takes over our world. And we begin to think in terms that there is only God ultimately. There are other things, but there's no longer an attachment to them or a sense that they are opposite of God or opposed to God, but manifest that, and especially humans are manifesting who God is, and at the same time providing the Trinity or God with the chance to experience what it's like to be human in each of us. In other words, it's a way that God can be equal in nothingness with us.
Can Christianity actually become a part of transforming our 21st century culture?
World religion, picking people up as they do at magic and mythic stages, is one of the few that can then move them through these stages into higher stages. So it can say, here's, it can give a magic catechism and then do that for until they're ready to move to myth, whenever that might be. And then here's the mythic version of Christianity, and this is the form your belief structure will take now. And then adolescence, here's a rational form of your faith, and here's the way you can believe in it now, and here's the way you can state it and argue it now. And then into early adulthood, here's a pluralistic form. And so it can actually act as what I call a conveyor belt. It can actually move people through these stages of development. And I think that that's one of the most important things that has to happen, because everybody is born at square one. Everybody starts out with magical beliefs and mythical beliefs, and nobody escapes that. And so we either invent new myths entirely, or we use the ones we've already got. They're fine. And so having something like Christianity get on board with teaching conveyor belt and having the earlier stages be magic and mythic, which is particularly the mythic stage is the way Sunday school, for example, is just taught. But then move into rational and into pluralistic and into integral and actually take people with them. That would be, ideally, to me, what the world's religions like that would be doing. And then at any time the person wants to get serious about waking up, about discovering God, then they could turn right and take up meditation. And a combination of those two effects would be what I would see, hopefully, Christianity doing? So, conveyor belt on one hand, and then here's meditative state contemplation on the other, for when you might ever want that. And if they would do those two things, it would change the face of the world a lot more than, the so-called new paradigm that we're getting and all of that. That's very little effect. But to have things like the Christian church actually introduce these things would be profound. Absolutely profound.
Ultimately, what do I need to remember as I move forward with exploring my Christianity?
It's really a question of seeing everyone as God, or as Christ, or as God in them, or as yourself, all of which is taught in the major scriptures. As Isaiah said, if you see a naked man, clothe him, and despise not your own flesh. So in some way, all flesh is the same, and everything is interconnected, interdependent. And so what we do to others, we're doing to ourselves. What we don't do for ourselves, we don't do for others. And all of their virtues are ours in a certain sense, but so are our vices theirs. So it's a great service to clean up our own act and to get over the compulsions and addictions of the false self as far as possible, in such a way as to put the consequent distress, discouragement, and despair even in ourselves, to overcome that by an invincible confidence in the higher power and the goodness both of God and of human nature.
For more Father Thomas Keating and Ken Wilber, watch the Deeper Inquiries DVD. It includes Father Keating's presentation on divine therapy and the extraordinary dialogue between Ken and Father Thomas on the differences between spirituality and religion. Join the conversation about the future of Christianity occurring now at integrallife.com. We have an active community and over 100 hours of media content on integral Christianity, spirituality, personal growth, and much more.